And also, having made the repairs to transport, finally, the treasure to the judge. So, theoretically, the second affirmative speaker doesn't need to bring the treasure back, but it's more difficult, because, in that way, to get the treasure here, because that means that what you're doing is you're working with another ship, or you're working with a ship that's very severely damaged, and the architect of that vessel is in a different country, trying, if you allow me to belabor the metaphor, trying to get aboard this ship and basically trying to sail it back. You could theoretically say that the architect is already aboard this ship, and it's okay, that architect can still sail the vessel back. The only problem is that there isn't necessarily a good shot that the necessary repairs will be done to this vessel by the end of it all, when you arrive to where the judge is. So you might not actually be able to bring your bounty back home. There's your whole difficulty. This is why it's so important that in the second affirmative speech, the speaker really brings everything home. So that we can do the necessary repairs in the last affirmative speech. And while the metaphor may seem belabored and tacked on, I think that you get the geist of it. The whole point here is that it's very unlikely that the judge will vote for the affirmative before the last affirmative speech, which is mainly used to repair the vessel. It's possible that the second affirmative speaker can bring the treasure home and win the judge's ballot, so to speak. And it's a matter of dispute whether the ballot is the treasure or the bounty. But, most likely, repairing damage has to be done first. And most likely, this has to be brought back home. What does this mean? These are your voters. And they're a function of your impacts and how they relate to your value criteria. That's what it means to sail them back home. But it isn't until after all the damage is repaired, that is to say, that all the advantages and the disadvantages have been addressed, that we can sail these voters to the judge, and thereby collect the bounty, which is the judge's ballot. That's what the treasure was all along. It's the voters. But we can't sail the voters to the judge until the end. We can only bring them back home. Which is another way of saying the judge can't vote for the voters unless they're mentioned in the last speech. But the judge can note us bringing the voters back home by alluding to them and how our case solves. It's another expression for this is therefore solvency. That's one kind of voter, though there are other voters as well. There can be voters that we take by piracy from our opponents, And that's what a critique is. It's no surprise that people oftentimes describe me as being a critique judge, and a critique debater, and all I think is, no, I'm just a philosopher. But at heart, my first ever Halloween costume was that of a pirate. Second neg speech. Second neg vessel. Whereas the affirmative operates one vessel, the negative has the advantage of what we sometimes call the burden of the negative or the vacuum of the negative. That is to say, they only have to negate. They don't have to be consistent in their negation, they just have to point out how you are inconsistent. For that reason, they don't need to bring one vessel home and only one. They don't have to rely upon one consistent item. They can have multiple moving at the same time, in contradiction. Second neg speech has options, just like the second aff speech. Second neg speech should attack the affirmative, help to repair the first negative, and if need be, will also take the treasure back. Along with the captain of the first neg speech. There, repairs will be done, and the treasure brought to the judge before the affirmative can even get there. Though keep in mind that even if both of these get to the judge, how they're weighed and assessed will still be dependent largely upon the first affirmative and the last affirmative. I mean, the first affirmative speaker speaking in the last affirmative speech. So while the neg, in an optimum world where we both manage to get our voters to the judge, has the advantage of getting there first, the affirmative has the advantage of having the say on what the judge should value out of these two. Will you have the 5 or the 6? For example. And don't get eeried out. That wasn't all 100% masterminded. I'm not that crazy. Oh look, snake eyes. But that's the idea. Now, the second negative is a very exciting place to be, therefore. There's a chance that the second negative ship is never even going to make it back to shore. And maybe even the second negative speaker isn't going to make it back home. There's something in the second negative of a kamikaze. This is why it's oftentimes described as one of the most difficult of the speeches. Personally, maybe I'm just getting intimidated. Maybe difficulty is something that we project. We think things are more difficult than they are because we complicate things. We expect things to make perfect rational sense in the way that people have described them to us. And so if someone describes something to us as being difficult, we believe it to be difficult. And we strive to meet that standard. But really, the second negative is actually what is most fun. The second negative speaker has a lot of choice in how to go about this. He or she, but in this case he, can choose to take the treasure home or not. Though again, the advantage would be to take that treasure home. Because otherwise, the first negative is going to have a very, very hard time bringing it home. Because there's only so much it can do to repair its own damages. Because as we all know, you're not supposed to bring up new stuff in the last speech. And you might risk suffering